The Charter of the United Nations, UN, is the foundational treaty of the United Nations. It establishes the purposes, governing structure, and overall framework of the UN system, including its 6 principal organs: the Secretariat, the General Assembly, the Security Council, the Economic and Social Council, the International Court of Justice, and the Trusteeship Council. The UN Charter mandates the UN and its member states to maintain international peace and security, uphold international law, achieve higher standards of living for their citizens, address economic, social, health, and related problems, and promote universal respect for, and observance of, human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. As a charter and constituent treaty, its rules and obligations are binding on all members and supersede those of other treaties. During the Second World War, the Allies, formerly known as the United Nations, agreed to establish a new post-war international organization. Pursuant to this goal, the UN Charter was discussed, prepared, and drafted during the San Francisco Conference that began April 25, 1945, which involved most of the world's sovereign nations. Following 2/3 approval of each part, the final text was unanimously adopted by delegates and opened for signature on June 26, 1945. It was signed in San Francisco, United States, by 50 of the 51 original member countries. The Charter entered into force on October 24, 1945, following ratification by the 5 permanent members of the United Nations Security Council: China, France, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States, and a majority of the other signatories. This is considered the official starting date of the United Nations, with the first session of the General Assembly, representing all 51 initial members, opening in London the following January. The General Assembly formally recognized October 24 as United Nations Day in 1947, and declared it an official international holiday in 1971. With 193 parties, most countries have now ratified the Charter. The Charter consists of a preamble and 111 articles grouped into 19 chapters. The preamble consists of 2 principal parts. The first part contains a general call for the maintenance of peace and international security and respect for human rights. The second part of the preamble is a declaration in a contractual style that the governments of the peoples of the United Nations have agreed to the Charter, and it is the first international document regarding human rights. Chapter I sets forth the purposes of the United Nations, including the important provisions of the maintenance of international peace and security. Chapter 2 defines the criteria for membership in the United Nations. Chapters 3, 15, the bulk of the document, describe the organs and institutions of the UN and their respective powers. Chapter 16 and Chapter 17 describe arrangements for integrating the UN with established international law. Chapters 18 and Chapter 19 provide for amendment and ratification of the Charter. The following chapters deal with the enforcement powers of UN bodies. Chapter 6 describes the Security Council's power to investigate and mediate disputes. Chapter 7 describes the Security Council's power to authorize economic, diplomatic, and military sanctions, as well as the use of military force, to resolve disputes. Chapter 8 makes it possible for regional arrangements to maintain peace and security within their own region. Chapters 9 and Chapter X describe the UN's powers for economic and social cooperation, and the Economic and Social Council that oversee these powers. Chapters 12 and Chapter 13 describe the Trusteeship Council, which oversaw decolonization. Chapters 14 and Chapter 15 establish the powers of, respectively, the International Court of Justice and the United Nations Secretariat. Chapters 16 through Chapter 19 deal respectively with 16, miscellaneous provisions, 17, transitional security arrangements related to World War II, 18, the Charter amendment process, and 19, ratification of the Charter. Background. The principles and conceptual framework of the United Nations were formulated incrementally through a series of conferences by the Allied nations during the Second World War. The Declaration of St. James's Palace, issued in London on June 12, 1941, was the first joint statement of the goals and principles of the Allies, and the first to express a vision for a post-war world order. The declaration called for the willing cooperation of free peoples so that all may enjoy economic and social security. Roughly 2 months later, the United States and the United Kingdom issued a joint statement elaborating these goals, known as the Atlantic Charter. It called for no territorial changes made against the wishes of the people, the right to self-determination for all peoples, restoration of self-government to those deprived of it, reduction of trade barriers, global cooperation to secure better economic and social conditions for the world, freedom from fear and want, freedom of the seas, and abandonment of the use of force, including mutual disarmament after the war. Many of these principles would inspire or form part of the UN Charter. The following year, on January 1, 1942, representatives of 30 nations formerly at war with the Axis powers led by the Big Four powers of China, the Soviet Union, the UK, and the U.S. signed the Declaration by United Nations, which formalized the Anti-Axis Alliance and reaffirmed the purposes and principles of the Atlantic Charter. The following day, representatives of 22 other nations added their signatures. The term United Nations became synonymous with the Allies for the duration of the war, and was considered the formal name under which they were fighting. The Declaration by United Nations formed the basis of the United Nations Charter. Virtually all nations that acceded to it would be invited to take part in the 1945 San Francisco Conference to discuss and prepare the Charter. On October 30, 1943, the Declaration of the Four Nations, one of the four Moscow Declarations, was signed by the foreign ministers of the Big Four, calling for the establishment of a general international organization, based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all peace-loving states, and open to membership by all such states, large and small, for the maintenance of international peace and security. This was the first formal announcement that a new international organization was being contemplated to replace the moribund League of Nations. Pursuant to the Moscow Declarations, from August 21, 1944 to October 7, 1944, the U.S. hosted the Dumbarton Oaks Conference to develop a blueprint for what would become the United Nations. Many of the rules, principles, and provisions of the UN Charter were proposed during the conference, including the structure of the UN system, the creation of a Security Council to prevent future war and conflict, and the establishment of other organs of the organization, such as the General Assembly, International Court of Justice, and Secretariat. The conference was led by the Big Four, with delegates from other nations participating in the consideration and formulation of these principles. At the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, it was Prime Minister Jan Smuts of South Africa and Lord Cecil of the United Kingdom who came up with the structure of the League of Nations, with the League being divided into a League Assembly consisting of all the member states and a League Council consisting of the great powers. The same design that Smuts and Cecil had devised for the League of Nations was copied for the United Nations, with a Security Council made up of the great powers and a General Assembly of the UN member states. The subsequent Yalta Conference in February 1945 between the US, UK, and Soviet Union resolved the lingering debate regarding the voting structure of the proposed Security Council, calling for a Conference of United Nations in San Francisco on April 25, 1945 to prepare the charter of such an organization, along the lines proposed in the formal conversations of Dumbarton Oaks. The San Francisco Conference, formerly the United Nations Conference on International Organization, UNCIO, began as scheduled on April 25, 1945, with the goal of drafting a charter that would create a new international organization. The Big Four, which sponsored the event, invited all 46 signatories to the Declaration by United Nations. Conference delegates invited 4 more nations: the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Argentina, and recently liberated Denmark. The conference was perhaps the largest international gathering up to that point, with 850 delegates, along with advisors and organizers, for a total of 3,500 participants. An additional 2,500 representatives from media and various civil society groups were also in attendance. Plenary meetings involving all delegates were chaired on a rotational basis by the lead delegates of the Big Four. Several committees were formed to facilitate and address different aspects of the drafting process, with over 400 meetings convened in the subsequent weeks. Following multiple reviews, debates, and revisions, a final full meeting was held on June 25, 1945, with the final proposed draft posed to attendees. Following unanimous approval, the charter was signed by delegates the following day in Veterans Memorial Hall. The preamble to the treaty reads as follows: "We, the peoples of the United Nations, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has brought untold sorrow to mankind, and to reaffirm faith in fundamental human rights, in the dignity and worth of the human person, in the equal rights of men and women and of nations large and small, and to establish conditions under which justice and respect for the obligations arising from treaties and other sources of international law can be maintained, and to promote social progress and better standards of life in larger freedom. And for these ends, to practice tolerance and live together in peace with one another as good neighbors, and to unite our strength to maintain international peace and security, and to ensure, by the acceptance of principles and the institution of methods, that armed force shall not be used, save in the common interest, and to employ international machinery for the promotion of the economic and social advancement of all peoples, have resolved to combine our efforts to accomplish these aims. Accordingly, our respective governments, through representatives assembled in the city of San Francisco, who have exhibited their full powers found to be in good and due form, have agreed to the present Charter of the United Nations and do hereby establish an international organization to be known as the United Nations. Although the preamble is an integral part of the Charter, it does not set out any of the rights or obligations of member states. Its purpose is to serve as an interpretative guide for the provisions of the Charter through the highlighting of some of the core motives of the founders of the organization. Chapter I, Purposes and Principles. Article 1. The purposes of the United Nations are: 1. To maintain international peace and security, to take effective collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to the peace, and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of the peace, and to bring about by peaceful means, and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law, adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of the peace. 2. To develop friendly relations among nations based on respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples, and to take other appropriate measures to strengthen universal peace. 3. To achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character, and in promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. And 4. To be a center for harmonizing the actions of nations in the attainment of these common ends. Article 2. The organization and its members, in pursuit of the purposes stated in Article 1, shall act in accordance with the following principles. 1. The organization is based on the principle of the sovereign equality of all its members. 2. All members, in order to ensure, to all of them the rights and benefits resulting from membership, shall fulfill in good faith the obligations assumed by them in accordance with the present Charter. 3. All members shall settle their international disputes by peaceful means in such a manner that international peace and security, and justice, are not endangered. 4. All members shall refrain in their international relations from the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state, or in any other manner inconsistent with the purposes of the United Nations. 5. All members shall give the United Nations every assistance in any action it takes in accordance with the present Charter and shall refrain from giving assistance to any state against which the United Nations is taking preventive or enforcement action. 6. The organization shall ensure that states which are not members of the United Nations act in accordance with these principles so far as may be necessary for the maintenance of international peace and security. 7. Nothing contained in the present charter shall authorize the United Nations to intervene in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state or shall require the members to submit such matters to settlement under the present charter, but this principle shall not prejudice the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7 of the United Nations Charter. Chapter 2, Membership. Chapter 2 of the United Nations Charter deals with membership of the United Nations Organization. Chapter 3, Organs. 1. There are established as principal organs of the United Nations, a General Assembly, a Security Council, an Economic and Social Council, a Trusteeship Council, an International Court of Justice, and a Secretariat. 2. Such subsidiary organs as may be found necessary may be established in accordance with the present Charter. Chapter 4, the General Assembly. Chapter V, the Security Council. Composition. Article 23. 1. The Security Council shall consist of 15 members of the United Nations. The Republic of China, France, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and the United States of America shall be permanent members of the Security Council. The General Assembly shall elect 10 other members of the United Nations to be non-permanent members of the Security Council, due regard being specially paid, in the first instance to the contribution of members of the United Nations to the maintenance of international peace and security and to the other purposes of the organization, and also to equitable geographical distribution. 2. The non-permanent members of the Security Council shall be elected for a term of 2 years. In the first election of the non-permanent members after the increase of the membership of the Security Council from 11 to 15, 2 of the 4 additional members shall be chosen for a term of 1 year. A retiring member shall not be eligible for immediate re-election. 3. Each member of the Security Council shall have 1 representative. Functions and powers. Article 24. 1. In order to ensure prompt and effective action by the United Nations, its members confer on the Security Council primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security and agree that in carrying out its duties under this responsibility the Security Council acts on their behalf. 2. In discharging these duties the Security Council shall act in accordance with the purposes and principles of the United Nations. The specific powers granted to the Security Council for the discharge of these duties are laid down in Chapters 6, 7, 8, and 12. 3. The Security Council shall submit annual and, when necessary, special reports to the General Assembly for its consideration. Article 25. The members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present Charter. Article 26. In order to promote the establishment and maintenance of international peace and security with the least diversion for armaments of the world's human and economic resources, the Security Council shall be responsible for formulating, with the assistance of the Military Staff Committee referred to in Article 47, plans to be submitted to the members of the United Nations for the establishment of a system for the regulation of armaments. Voting. Article 27. 1. Each member of the Security Council shall have 1 vote. 2. Decisions of the Security Council on procedural matters shall be made by an affirmative vote of 9 members. 3. Decisions of the Security Council on all other matters shall be made by an affirmative vote of 9 members including the concurring votes of the permanent members, provided that, in decisions under Chapter 6, and under Paragraph 3 of Article 52, a party to a dispute shall abstain from voting. Procedure. Article 28. 1. The Security Council shall be so organized as to be able to function continuously. Each member of the Security Council shall for this purpose be represented at all times at the seat of the organization. 2. The Security Council shall hold periodic meetings at which each of its members may, if it so desires, be represented by a member of the government or by some other specially designated representative. 3. The Security Council may hold meetings at such places other than the seat of the organization as in its judgment will best facilitate its work. Article 29. The Security Council may establish as such subsidiary organs as it deems necessary for the performance of its functions. Article 30. The Security Council shall adopt its own rules of the procedure, including the method of selecting its president. Article 31. Any member of the United Nations which is not a member of the Security Council may participate, without vote, in the discussion of any question brought before the Security Council whenever the latter considers that the interests of that member are specially affected. Article 32. Any member of the United Nations which is not a member of the Security Council or any state which is not a member of the United Nations, if it is a party to a dispute under consideration by the Security Council, shall be invited to participate, without vote, in the discussion relating to the dispute. The Security Council shall lay down such conditions as it deems just for the participation of a state which is not a member of the United Nations. Chapter 6, Peaceful Settlement of Disputes. Chapter 7, Action with respect to threats to the peace, breaches of the peace, and acts of aggression. Chapter 8, Regional Arrangements. Chapter 9, International Economic and Social Cooperation. Chapter X, the Economic and Social Council. Chapter 11, Declaration regarding non-self-governing territories. Chapter 12, International Trusteeship System. Chapter 13, the Trusteeship Council. Chapter 14, the International Court of Justice. Chapter 15, the Secretariat. It comprises the Secretary General and such other staff as the organization may require. It provides services to the other organs of the United Nations, such as the General Assembly, the SC, the ECOSOC, and the Trusteeship Council, as well as their subsidiary bodies. The Secretary General is appointed by the General Assembly on the recommendation of Security Council. The staff of the Secretariat is appointed by the Secretary General according to the regulations laid down by the General Assembly. The Secretariat is located at the headquarters of the UN in New York. The Secretariat also includes the Regional Commission Secretariat at Baghdad, Bangkok, Geneva, and Santiago. Functions of the Secretariat. 1. Preparation of report and other documents containing information, analysis, historical background, research finding, policy suggestions and so forth, to facilitate deliberations and decision-making by other organs. 2. To facilitate legislative organs and their subsidiary bodies. 3. Provision of meeting services for the General Assembly and other organs. 4. Provision of editorial, translation, and document reproduction services for the issuance of UN documents in different language. 5. Conduct of studies and provision of information to various member states in meeting challenge in various fields. 6. Preparation of statistical publication, information bulletin, and analytical work which the General Assembly has decided. 7. Organization of conferences, experts group meetings and seminar on topics of concern to the international community. 8. Provision of technical assistance to developed countries. 9. Understanding of service mission to countries, areas, or location as authorized by the General Assembly or the Security. Chapter 16, Miscellaneous Provisions. Chapter 17, Transitional Security Arrangements. Chapter 18, Amendments. The General Assembly has the power to amend the UN Charter. Amendments adopted by a vote of 2/3 of the members of the Assembly need to be ratified by 2/3 of the member states, including all the permanent members of the Security Council. Chapter 19, Ratification and Signature. Provided that the Charter would enter into force once ratified by the permanent 5 members of the United Nations Security Council and a majority of the other signatory states, and set forth related procedures, such as providing certified copies to ratifying governments. United Nations is an international organization that acts as a global platform for cooperation among world's countries. It was established on October 24, 1945 in San Francisco, United States of America. After the devastating World War II, the world realized that it was extremely important to prevent such a future conflict. For prevention of wars, the world needed a global platform where nations could come together and resolve their conflicts through peaceful measures. Thus, the United Nations, UN, was created by a group of 51 countries. Later on, the UN was also entrusted with the global developmental goals. The UN was established on October 24, 1945 in San Francisco, USA. 51 nations were the founding members of the UN. Founder members signed the Charter of the United Nations Treaty to create the UN. Chief of the UN is called the Secretary General. Tregavly was the first elected Secretary General of the United Nations. Headquarters of the UN is located in the New York City, USA. The UN system consists 6 principal organs. 1 General Assembly. 2 Security Council. 3 Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC. 4 International Court of Justice, and 5 UN Secretariat. 6 Trusteeship Council, operations suspended in 1994. 4 principal organs of the UN are located at the UN headquarters in New York City. The International Court of Justice is located in The Hague, Netherlands. 5 permanent members of the Security Council hold the veto power. These members are France, the People's Republic of China, Russia, the United Kingdom and the United States. 6 official languages of the UN are Arabic, Chinese, English, French, Russian and Spanish. At present the UN has 193 member states and 2 observer states. Purpose and role of the United Nations. The United Nations has the 3 main objectives: peacekeeping and security. The primary objective of the United Nations was to act an intermediary in conflict resolution among world's nations. The founder members envisioned the purpose of UN as a place where world's problems are resolved through dialogue and agreements. Also, the UN peacekeeping forces have been instrumental in reducing the effects of military conflicts. Ensuring human rights. One of the UN's primary purposes is promoting and encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion, and member states pledge to undertake joint and separate action to protect these rights. In 1993, the United Nations Commission on Human Rights was formed to oversee human rights issues for the United Nations. The UN has provided stages for signing and implementation of several treaties for human rights. For example, International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, 1966. International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, 1966. Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, 1979. Convention on the Rights of the Child, 1989. Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, 2006. Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, 2008. Economic Development and Humanitarian Assistance. Another primary purpose of the UN is to achieve international cooperation in solving international problems of an economic, social, cultural, or humanitarian character. In the year 2000, the UN floated the Millennium Development Goals to be achieved all the 192 signatory countries by 2015. In 2015, the Sustainable Development Goals succeeded and these are to be achieved by 2030. The World Bank and the International Monetary Fund are primary UN agencies that provide financial assistance for uniform economic development as well as on humanitarian basis. Other UN bodies like World Food Programme and Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees also play crucial role in providing humanitarian assistance. Other objectives. United Nations and its specialized agencies, like UNDP, WHO, UNESCO, UNICEF etc., also run programs for ensuring development and human rights all around the world. Through World Health Organization, the United Nations has played a key role in combating global health issues including viral diseases like HIV/AIDS, polio, COVID-19 etc. Thank you for watching this video.